Dad is gone. This house belongs to us now. Those were the first words my daughter-in-law said to me after the funeral, and my son stood right beside her without saying a single word. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply looked down at the plate in front of me and realized that after 43 years of marriage, after raising a son, after building a home filled with memories, I was suddenly being treated like a guest in my own life. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 71 years old, and until 3 days ago, I believed I knew exactly who my family was. George and I had spent most of our lives in the same colonial-style house outside Columbus, Ohio. We bought it when Richard was 6 years old. The paint had faded, the roof needed work, and we barely had enough money for the down payment. But George always said it wasn't the house that mattered. It was the life we built inside it. For decades, that house held birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family dinners, and quiet evenings when George and I sat on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the maple trees. Then, 3 weeks ago, George passed away unexpectedly. One moment he was sitting in his favorite recliner reading a book. The next, everything changed. The days that followed felt like a blur of sympathy cards, casseroles from neighbors, funeral arrangements, and endless paperwork. I moved through it all in a fog, barely able to process the fact that the man who had shared my life for more than 4 decades was gone. The funeral itself was beautiful. Friends traveled from several states away. Former co-workers spoke warmly about George. Even strangers came up to me afterward and shared stories about his kindness. For a few hours, I felt surrounded by love. But grief has a way of revealing truths that comfort often hides. That evening, after everyone returned to the house, Vanessa insisted on hosting a small family dinner. The dining room felt different without George sitting at the head of the table. His chair remained empty. I found myself looking at it over and over again, almost expecting him to walk in and make one of his terrible jokes. Instead, there was silence. Heavy silence. Vanessa set down her wine glass and folded her hands together. Richard stared at his plate. I knew something was coming before either of them spoke. Dad is gone, Vanessa finally said. This house belongs to us now. The words hung in the air. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. But then she continued. She talked about practical decisions, future plans, renovations. She spoke as if the house had already changed ownership, as if I were simply a temporary inconvenience standing in the way. I waited for Richard to interrupt her. I waited for my son to tell her she was wrong. Instead, he looked away. That hurt more than anything she could have said. I excused myself quietly and walked upstairs. My legs felt heavier with every step. When I reached our bedroom, I closed the door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed. George's reading glasses were still resting on the nightstand exactly where he'd left them. Beside them sat his wristwatch and an unopened novel he'd planned to start. I stared at those objects for a long time. Then I noticed something I had never seen before. Tucked beneath the watch was a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. And beneath it was a handwritten note in George's unmistakable handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up and read the single sentence written across the folded paper. Only open this if they show you who they really are. I sat there for several minutes with the note resting in my lap. The room was completely silent except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. George had always been thoughtful, but this felt different, deliberate, planned, as though he had anticipated a moment he hoped would never come. I turned the small brass key over in my hand. It was old, slightly worn around the edges, and attached to a blue ribbon I recognized immediately. 20 years earlier, George had tied that same ribbon around a Christmas ornament because he said it reminded him of the sky on the day we met. The memory hit me unexpectedly. For a moment, I could almost hear his laugh. Then the sound of footsteps downstairs pulled me back to reality. Vanessa was speaking. Her voice carried easily through the floorboards. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough. Renovation, listing value, market conditions. Richard answered occasionally, his voice low and uncertain. They were discussing the house as if I were already gone. I carefully folded the note and slipped it into my sweater pocket. Then I placed the key inside my purse. Something told me not to mention either one. Not yet. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For 43 years, George had been the first person awake in the house. He always made coffee before I came downstairs. That morning, the kitchen felt unfamiliar. Empty. I stood by the window watching the first light spread across the backyard. The maple trees swayed gently in the cold Ohio breeze. Everything outside looked exactly the same. Inside, everything had changed. Around 8 o'clock, Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing exercise clothes and carrying her phone. She smiled when she saw me, but it was not a warm smile. It was the kind people use when they are trying to appear polite. "Good morning, Margaret," she said. Margaret. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitmore. Just Margaret. I noticed the change immediately. "Good morning," I replied. She poured herself coffee and glanced toward the window. "Richard and I have been talking about some future plans. We think it might be helpful to start discussing options for everyone." Everyone. Another carefully chosen word. I nodded as if I did not understand what she was really saying. She seemed disappointed that I was not reacting. Later that afternoon, Richard stopped by my room. He stood awkwardly near the door with his hands in his pockets. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. "Mom, how are you holding up?" he asked. I studied his face. The little boy who used to run through this house with scraped knees and endless questions was still there somewhere. But he felt far away now. "I am managing," I said quietly. He nodded and looked down at the floor. Neither of us mentioned the conversation from the night before. Neither of us mentioned the house. After he left, I opened my purse and stared at the brass key again. George had left me many things over the years. Advice, memories, trust, and now this. Whatever it opened, I knew one thing for certain. My husband had not hidden it without a reason. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt curiosity. Over the next few days, I began noticing things that grief had hidden from me before. Small things, quiet things, the kind of details that seem meaningless until they start forming a pattern. Vanessa spent more time on her phone than usual. Whenever I entered a room, conversations ended abruptly. Richard seemed nervous all the time, as though he were carrying a burden he could not put down. One afternoon, I walked into George's old study and found several shelves completely empty. The framed photographs that had always sat on his desk were gone. So were some of his personal files. For a moment, I simply stood there staring at the bare spaces. George had been meticulous about his paperwork. Every insurance policy, tax document, and property record had a designated place. He used to joke that if a tornado ever hit Ohio, he would still know exactly where every receipt was. Seeing those shelves empty unsettled me. Later that evening, I overheard Vanessa speaking on the phone in the living room. I was not trying to listen. I had only come downstairs for a glass of water. But when I heard the words appraisal and listing agent, I stopped. "The timing has to be right," she said quietly. "We are closer than you think." I stepped back before she could see me. My heart was beating faster now. Not from fear, from certainty. They were planning something. The following morning, I decided to drive into town. It was the first time I had left the house alone since the funeral. The familiar streets brought back memories of happier years. George and I had spent countless Saturdays visiting the farmer's market, stopping for coffee, and arguing playfully about which flowers to plant each spring. I parked near the town square and sat in the car for several minutes. Then I opened my purse and took out the brass key again. There was only one place I could think of that might require a key like this. The First Community Bank. George had maintained a safe deposit box there for decades. I remembered accompanying him once many years ago, though he had never discussed what he kept inside. At the time, I had not cared. We trusted each other completely. As I sat there holding the key, a strange memory surfaced. About 6 months before he passed away, George had asked me an unusual question. We had been sitting on the back porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the horizon. Out of nowhere, he said, "Margaret, if people ever disappoint you, promise me you will not let them decide your worth." I had laughed and asked why he was suddenly becoming philosophical. He smiled and changed the subject. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now it felt important. Very important. I slipped the key back into my purse and started the engine. Whatever George had left behind was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming a message. And with every passing day, I felt more certain that my husband had seen something coming long before I ever did. The question was not whether he had prepared for it. The question was how much he knew. The First Community Bank looked exactly the way it had for years. The same brick exterior. The same American flag near the entrance. The same elderly security guard sitting near the front door reading a newspaper. As I walked inside, I felt an odd sense of calm. For days, grief, confusion, and suspicion had followed me everywhere. Now, for the first time, I felt as though I was moving toward answers. A young woman at the front desk greeted me politely and directed me to one of the private offices. 10 minutes later, a branch manager named Thomas Reynolds joined me. He was probably in his late 50s, neatly dressed, with the kind of professional smile that comes from decades of working with people. The moment I introduced myself, his expression changed. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently, "I was very sorry to hear about your husband." I thanked him. Then I placed the brass key on the desk. His eyes immediately settled on it. "I believe this belongs to a safe deposit box," I said. Thomas studied the key for a moment before opening a computer file. After several seconds, he nodded. "Yes, ma'am. This key belongs to a private box registered under George Whitmore's name." My heart skipped. "Can I access it?" I asked. Thomas reviewed several documents before looking back at me. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, according to our records, your husband added your name as a co-owner approximately 18 months ago." 18 months. The number echoed in my mind. George had prepared this long before his health declined. Long before the funeral. Long before Vanessa began making plans for the house. Thomas led me through a secure hallway into the vault area. The heavy steel door opened slowly. Inside were hundreds of safe deposit boxes lining the walls. He located the correct one and stepped away to give me privacy. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted the key. The lock clicked. The metal drawer slid forward. Inside sat a thick manila envelope, several folders, and a smaller sealed package wrapped in brown paper. Everything had been organized with George's usual precision. On top of the envelope was another handwritten note. Seeing his familiar handwriting almost brought tears to my eyes. I carefully unfolded the paper. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then events unfolded the way I feared they might. Please do not be afraid. Everything you need is here." I stared at those words for a long time. George was speaking to me from beyond the years we had shared together. Not dramatically, not emotionally, simply and directly, exactly the way he always had. I opened the envelope next. Inside were property records, legal documents, and copies of financial statements. At first, most of it seemed routine. Then I reached a document that made me stop breathing for a moment. It was a trust agreement, and according to the signature dates, George had created it nearly 2 years earlier. I continued reading. With every page, my confusion gave way to astonishment. The house was not owned the way Richard and Vanessa believed. In fact, the ownership structure had been changed entirely. George had quietly transferred key assets into protections designed specifically for one purpose: protecting me, protecting my future, protecting the home we built together. I slowly lowered the papers into my lap. Suddenly, dozens of strange moments from the past 2 years began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. George's private meetings, his unexpected appointments, the legal paperwork he occasionally mentioned but never explained. He had seen something. He had recognized a danger I never noticed. And whatever it was, he had spent years preparing for it. For nearly an hour, I remained inside the private room at the bank, carefully reading every document George had left behind. The deeper I went, the more I realized that my husband had not acted out of suspicion alone. He had acted out of observation. There were notes attached to several folders in his handwriting. Short comments, dates, reminders, small details that meant little by themselves, but painted a much larger picture when viewed together. One note mentioned conversations about the house that had taken place months before his passing. Another referenced concerns about pressure being placed on Richard regarding future financial decisions. George never accused anyone directly. That was not his style. Instead, he documented facts. Quietly, methodically, the same way he approached everything in life. Near the bottom of the box, I found the sealed package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather notebook I had never seen before. The first page contained a simple sentence. "If you are reading this, trust what you see, not what people tell you." I turned the page. The notebook contained personal observations written over nearly 2 years. George described changes he had noticed within the family. Growing impatience. Discussions about inheritance that seemed premature. Remarks about the house that made him uncomfortable. None of it was dramatic. None of it was explosive. That was what made it so powerful. It was real. I sat back in my chair and closed the notebook. Suddenly, memories I had ignored for years began resurfacing. The family dinner where Vanessa joked that the property was worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The holiday gathering where Richard asked unusual questions about ownership records. The times George became unusually quiet whenever conversations turned toward money. I had dismissed those moments because I trusted my family completely. George had noticed them because he was paying attention. Before leaving the bank, I carefully organized everything back into the envelope and asked Thomas for copies of several key documents. As he prepared them, he glanced toward me with concern. "Your husband was very thorough," he said. "He wanted to make certain you would be protected." I nodded. That word stayed with me all the way home. Protected. When I pulled into the driveway, I immediately noticed a truck parked near the curb. Two men were measuring sections of the front yard while Vanessa stood nearby speaking with them. She smiled when she saw me, but I recognized something new in her expression. Confidence. The confidence of someone who believed victory was already guaranteed. "We are just gathering information," she explained casually as I stepped from the car. "Nothing has been decided yet." I smiled politely. "Of course," I replied. She seemed surprised by my calm reaction. That evening, I sat quietly through dinner while Vanessa discussed market trends and renovation ideas. Richard barely spoke. Every now and then, he glanced at me as though he expected an argument. Instead, I listened. I asked polite questions. I thanked Vanessa for preparing the meal. The more agreeable I appeared, the more relaxed she became. By the end of the evening, she seemed convinced that I had accepted whatever future she had planned. But later that night, alone in my bedroom, I opened George's notebook again. As I turned the final page, a folded sheet of paper slipped onto my lap. Across the top, written in his unmistakable handwriting, were 6 words that made my heart race. "Do not sign anything without David." The next morning, I woke earlier than usual and read the note again. 6 simple words. "Do not sign anything without David." I searched my memory, trying to understand why George had singled out that name. Then it came back to me. David Mercer had been George's attorney for nearly 20 years. He was not just a lawyer. He was one of the few people George trusted completely. If George had left that instruction behind, it meant he expected documents to appear. It meant he believed someone would eventually ask me to sign something. 2 days later, that moment arrived. Vanessa announced that she had organized a family meeting for Saturday afternoon. She framed it as an opportunity for everyone to discuss the future. Her tone was cheerful, helpful, thoughtful, yet every instinct told me there was another purpose behind it. By noon on Saturday, the dining room table was covered with folders, notepads, and neatly arranged paperwork. Richard sat beside Vanessa looking uncomfortable. He barely touched the coffee in front of him. Vanessa, however, seemed energized. She smiled often. She spoke confidently. She behaved like someone already in control of the outcome. "We all need to think practically," she said. "The house is large. The upkeep is expensive. There are better options available." I listened quietly. She presented charts showing property values, estimates from contractors, information about retirement communities located within 30 miles of town. The entire presentation felt rehearsed. Every answer arrived too quickly. Every document appeared perfectly prepared. Finally, she slid a folder toward me. "This is only a preliminary agreement," she explained. "Nothing complicated. It simply allows us to begin exploring possibilities." I looked down at the papers but did not open them. Instead, I folded my hands and asked a simple question. "Has David reviewed this?" For the first time all afternoon, Vanessa hesitated. Only for a second, but I noticed. Richard noticed too. "David?" she asked. "David Mercer," I replied calmly. "George's attorney." A strange silence settled over the room. Richard shifted in his chair. Vanessa forced a smile. "I do not think that is necessary right now." Necessary. Another carefully chosen word. George had taught me something during our marriage. When people avoid direct answers, they are often protecting something. "Then I will wait," I said. "I will not sign anything until David reviews it." Vanessa's expression tightened. Not dramatically, just enough for me to see the frustration beneath her composure. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Richard followed me into the hallway. As everyone gathered their things, for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. "Mom," he said quietly, "did Dad leave something behind?" I looked at my son carefully. There was confusion in his eyes. Doubt. Perhaps even regret. "Your father left many things behind," I answered softly. "Some people just have not discovered them yet." That evening, I sat alone on the back porch watching the sunset fade beyond the trees. The air carried the familiar scent of freshly cut grass. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything felt different now. For weeks, I had been reacting to events. Now I was beginning to understand them. George had not simply prepared documents. He had prepared a path. And for the first time since his passing, I felt as though I was finally walking in the direction he intended. 3 days later, I received a phone call from David Mercer. His voice was calm and professional, but there was something else beneath it. Concern. "Margaret," he said, "I believe it is time we met." We arranged to meet the following morning at his office downtown. When I arrived, he greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room. The moment the door closed, he opened a thick file and placed it on the table between us. "Your husband came to see me several times during the last 2 years of his life," he explained. "He was not worried about money. He was worried about you." I listened quietly as David walked me through document after document. Every page confirmed what George had suspected. The trust had been carefully designed to prevent anyone from pressuring me into giving up ownership rights. The house could not be sold without my approval. More importantly, certain provisions would immediately activate if anyone attempted to manipulate or coerce decisions regarding the property. George had built safeguards into every layer of the plan. "He loved you very much," David said softly. I looked down at the papers and smiled. "I know." Before I left, David handed me a sealed envelope. "George instructed me to give you this only when you fully understood the situation." The envelope felt heavier than it should have. I waited until I reached home before opening it. Inside was a short letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then you have already discovered part of the truth. What matters most is not the house. It is seeing people clearly. Do not let anger guide you. Let facts guide you. The truth always arrives eventually." I read those words 3 times. Then I folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the others. That evening, Vanessa announced another family gathering. This one sounded different, more urgent. She explained that a real estate consultant would be joining us to discuss opportunities. Richard remained unusually quiet during the entire conversation. I noticed him watching Vanessa several times, as if he were beginning to question things himself. Saturday arrived. By late afternoon, several folders sat neatly arranged across the dining room table again. Vanessa seemed confident, almost triumphant. She welcomed everyone with bright smiles and spoke enthusiastically about timelines, market demand, and future plans. Then she slid a stack of documents toward me. "If we can take care of these today," she said, "everything will move much faster." I glanced down at the papers. Then I looked up at her. "I invited someone to join us," I said calmly. The room became still. Richard frowned slightly. Vanessa blinked. Before either of them could respond, the front doorbell rang. A few seconds later, David Mercer walked into the dining room, carrying a leather briefcase. The color drained from Vanessa's face. For the first time since George passed away, I watched certainty disappear from her eyes. David set his briefcase on the dining room table and greeted everyone politely. The room felt different immediately. The confidence Vanessa had displayed all afternoon began to fade beneath the weight of uncertainty. She forced a smile and invited him to sit down, but her voice sounded tighter than before. David thanked her and calmly removed several folders from his briefcase. Then he looked directly at me. "Margaret, would you like me to explain your husband's estate plan?" I nodded. Richard leaned forward slightly. Vanessa remained completely still. David opened the first folder and began speaking in the same measured tone he had used in his office. He explained the trust structure George had established. He explained the protections built into the property ownership. He explained that the house was not subject to any sale without my direct authorization. Most importantly, he explained that George had anticipated future disputes and had taken legal steps to prevent anyone from exerting undue influence over me. The silence around the table became almost uncomfortable. Richard looked genuinely confused. "Dad never mentioned any of this," he said quietly. "No," David replied. "That was intentional." Vanessa finally spoke. "Surely there must be some misunderstanding. We were only trying to help Margaret make practical decisions." David nodded politely. "I understand." However, George's instructions were extremely clear. He opened another folder and slid a document across the table. "This provision is particularly important." I watched as Richard read the page. His expression changed immediately. He looked up at David, then at me. Dad added this, he asked. Approximately 2 years ago, David answered. Vanessa reached for the document. As she scanned the page, the color slowly disappeared from her face. According to the provision, any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or rush decisions regarding the property would automatically trigger additional oversight protections administered through the trust. George had not merely protected the house. He had protected the decision-making process itself. Every path had been anticipated. Every loophole had been closed. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then David removed one final item from his briefcase. A sealed envelope bearing George's signature. My heart tightened the moment I saw it. Your husband instructed me to present this only if certain circumstances occurred, David explained. I believe this qualifies. He handed the envelope to me. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter addressed to the entire family. I unfolded the pages carefully and began reading aloud. George's words filled the room. He wrote about love, about family, about responsibility. He wrote that wealth could be replaced, but trust could not. He wrote that true character revealed itself during difficult times. Near the end, one sentence seemed to settle over everyone like a shadow. If Margaret is reading this letter, then she has already seen something that disappointed me deeply. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. When I finished reading, I folded the letter and placed it gently on the table. Across from me, Richard stared at the pages with tears gathering in his eyes. Vanessa could not meet anyone's gaze. And for the first time since George passed away, the truth was no longer hidden behind polite conversations and careful smiles. It was sitting openly in the center of the table where everyone could finally see it. After David finished speaking, nobody rushed to fill the silence. The house felt strangely still, as though even the walls were listening. Richard remained seated, staring at the letter his father had written. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then he slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I had seen that gesture hundreds of times throughout his life. He did it when he was overwhelmed, when he was disappointed in himself, or when he realized he had made a mistake he could not easily undo. Finally, he looked at me. Mom, I am sorry. The words were quiet, simple, honest. There was no speech prepared in advance. No excuse attached to them. Just regret. I nodded gently. I know. Across the table, Vanessa sat motionless. The confidence that had carried her through the previous weeks had vanished completely. She opened her mouth several times as if searching for the right explanation, but nothing came. The documents were clear. George's intentions were clear. Most importantly, the truth was clear. For the first time, nobody could pretend otherwise. David gathered his papers and stood. Before leaving, he handed me one final envelope. Your husband asked me to deliver this after everything was settled, he said. Once the front door closed behind him, I opened it carefully. Inside was a small note written in George's familiar handwriting. It contained only a few sentences. Margaret, if you are reading this, then you already know the house was never the most important thing. A home is built by love, respect, and trust. Keep the people who honor those things. Let go of the rest. And remember that you were always stronger than you believed. I felt tears in my eyes for the first time in weeks. Not because I was sad, because I could hear his voice in every word. That night, I sat alone on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The same porch where George and I had shared thousands of evenings together. The same porch where he had quietly prepared me for a future I never imagined. The air was cool. The neighborhood was peaceful. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing as they rode bicycles down the street. Life was continuing, just as it always does. Richard joined me after a while and sat in the chair beside mine. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Then he looked out toward the backyard and said, Dad knew me better than I knew myself. I smiled sadly. He usually did. We sat together until the last light faded from the sky. In the months that followed, many things changed. Some relationships healed slowly. Others never returned to what they once were. But one thing became certain. I never left the house. The home George and I built remained exactly where it belonged. More importantly, I stopped measuring my worth by how others treated me. George had left behind legal documents, letters, and careful plans. Yet his greatest gift was something far simpler. He left me the truth. And once I finally saw it, I never looked at my life the same way again.